Welcome everyone. I am Ibrahim Fawzy, a teaching assistant at Fayoum University in Egypt, and I'm going to present my paper entitled The Poetics of Memory in Fatna al-Buhi's Talk of Darkness and Marina Na'mat's Prisoner of Tehran. Although the memory of colonial violence and collective traumas is not new in post-colonial and contemporary Middle Eastern narratives, disrupting taboos on the freedom of thought and remembering the effects of cruelty have offered new areas of exploration in the genre of memoir. The memoirs are the subaltern reconstructions of collective memory that oppose the authoritarian discourses. In this paper, I investigate how Talk of Darkness and The Prisoner of Tehran offer new forms for the exploration of agency, trauma, and torture in the Middle East, the impossibility of narrating life in captivity, and other ways in which violence is remembered in the selected prison memoirs. I focus on the work of memory in Talk of Darkness and Prisoner of Tehran and contend that the memoir not only disrupts taboos on the narration of prison and torture, but also addresses broader anxieties over women's resistance, subjectivity, and the right to represent their memory in the form of memoir. Prison memoirs are voices that invite us into the personal lives and tales of many subjects who experienced fathomable conditions inside prisons. They unmask the officially denied violations of human rights. Memoirs sometimes transcend the personal to comment on the collective. They weave the past with the present, highlighting the continuity of oppression from colonialism to post-colonialism. When we move to the context of repression in Morocco and Iran, we find that the early 70s in Morocco witnessed many protests from students and opposition opposition groups, including Ilal Amam, led by Ibrahim Sarfati, and Linakhdim al-Sha'b, led by Muhammad Kirfati, and the 23 March. All these movements and the members of these movements, all these movements were leftist groups, and the members of these movements were arrested, tortured, mutilated, disappeared, and persecuted for years. Although they called for an egalitarian and democratic Moroccan society, they were accused of constituting a threat to national security. When we move to Iran, we find that Reza Shah and his son Mohammad Reza Shah used imprisonment as a tactic for silencing dissidents. Pahlavi rulers, as well as post-revolutionary rulers, perceived leftist radicals as their primary enemy. Yet under Reza Shah, the forms of incarceration and prison conditions were relatively mild. In 1931, a new law made any form of communist agitation subject to imprisonment. In Iran, the period between 1981 and 1988 marks a shameful era, blooded by mass execution. Many people were many people were incarcerated, tortured, and assassinated. At the infamous Evin prison located in North Tehran, female political activists were targeted by this state because of their bravery to enter a male-dominated field and express their opinions in the public sphere. Fatna al-Buhi's Talk of Darkness deals with the aesthetics of resistance. But before talking about this memoir, we have to know who is Fatna al-Buhi. Fatna al-Buhi is a well-known Moroccan activist. Her life embraces a wide array of roles. She was former political prisoner. She was a writer and sociologist. She was arrested briefly for the first time as a leader of the January 24, 1974 high school student strike to protest against the conditions in Morocco's secondary education. Her second arrest came in 1977 for membership in March 23 movement, which was a Marxist group that aimed at commemorating the March 23, 1965 Casablanca uprising. She was disappeared with other women from May to November 1977 into Derb Moulay Sharif, Casablanca's notorious secret torture center. After 7 months in Derb Moulay Sharif, she was brought before the investigating magistrate She was one of the six female political prisoners held from 1977 to 1979 without trial. El Bui helped to organize a prison hunger strike to establish the status of political detainees for her group of women prisoners. In 1980, she was finally brought to trial and sentenced by the Rabat court to 5 years in prison for conspiring against the security of the state and distributing political tracts and posters. El Bui completed her sentence at Kinaitra civil prison from 1980 to 1982. Her survival is compelling proof that women are not always muted without agency and voice. El Bui confirms a new Shahrazad emerges, emerges from silence to go beyond history, to where women are deprived of all power, to change the current of history. Shahrazad has spoken and a miracle has been produced. In 2001, she published her prison memoir, Hadith al-Atama, in English, Talk of Darkness. And it has been translated into many languages since 2001. In Dermulay Sharif, speaking was prohibited. So El Bui showed many logical forms of resistance. In her memoir, she portrays how she has been masculinized by the policemen, as they have called her Rashid. El Bui has resisted and has refused to surrender to this oppression inside the prison walls, to impose her feminine identity from which she has been deprived. El Bui has become Rashid because of her failure to enter politics, which belongs to men only. According to the regime, she deserved what had happened to her because she behaved outside the prescribed limits imposed by the society, and she also forms a threat to the regime. Yet, the researcher thinks that uh, it's not related to gender, but it's related to the police's strategies to destroy the political prisoner's identity and dignity, whether by giving them numbers instead of their names and by giving them other names sometimes, like Fatna al when they called her Rashid. She tries to create a collective identity to prove that the matter is not related to her as a single individual, but it's related to female political prisoners in general. As for Marina Namat's prisoner of Tehran, we will talk about her strategies of survival. Namat's prisoner of Tehran, which reflects on the author's experience before and after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, revolves around the trauma of her captivity and coincides with her narrated loss of the self. It's a story about a young girl who was imprisoned, tortured, and sentenced to death without even attending the trial. She's about to be shot by a firing squad when one of her jailers, Ali, who believed her claims of innocence, arrives to stop the execution. Ali falls in love with Marina and forces her to convert to Islam to marry him. Her sentence is reduced and eventually she is released to find herself arrested in her former jailer's house. When he's killed by shooting with Namat at his side, the trauma causes her to lose her baby. Finally, she's able to go back to her family. She does not speak and they do not ask. She marries the one she loved before her 2 year incarceration and they move to Canada with their two children. Marina Namat was born to a middle class family in Iran. And although she is not a rebel, she finds it difficult to attend her high school classes after the Islamic Revolution. Hence, she was put on a list of troublemakers and taken to even prison for questioning. Being a Christian in an Islamic state influences Namat's experience greatly. Namat experiences another type of imprisonment in Ali's house after he released from even prison. But here we have to affirm that Islam as a religion calls for peace and condemns violence. But some governments use Islam to justify their deeds. When we talk about memory, we find that memory, therefore, serves both to deal with a devastating past and to reinvent the self, since writing the self so as to relieve it from the heavy burden of a painful personal history of humiliation and suffering. Remember is not simply a mechanism to uncover the buried violent acts of the authoritarian regimes and both the sacrifices of those activists. But more importantly, the act of remembering is the first step to the act of forgetting. Writing for the subaltern means self-purgation of torture, humiliation, and suffering. El argues that if the page is black, it must first be grasped, read, and written. Writing is a form of deliverance. Many young women, many innocent women throughout Morocco appear on the list of victims, but dare not speak, testify, or write about what they endured. After much suffering, confesses Gramsci, after much suffering, one becomes used to being an object without subjectivity, vis-a-vis the administrative machine that at any moment can chip off in any direction, force you to change a habit. Gramsci informs his sister-in-law that he spared no effort to portray both the physical and psychological conditions in prison in detail. So, thinking that his writings are mere literature is a wrong deed. Namat and El-Bouy share Gramsci's insistence on writing as a means of bearing witness and speaking truth to power. Marina is getting through all the trouble things that happen with help from her memories. Her relationship with her parents is poor, and she has never felt close to them. But she has a lot of memories concerning her grandmother and how she stood up for her. Her memories from even are about to destroy her sanity. She tries to push them away, but they rush back both day and night. She has never talked about her experiences with anyone. She says, if I couldn't forget, perhaps the solution was to remember. To forget, to forget what happened is perhaps impossible, but it's a way for her to continue to live her new life. The guilt of not being able to help her friends will never fade away, but she has to accept the guilt and to continue to live a life of peace. I think that's all, and I hope that you enjoyed the presentation, and I'm waiting for your question. Thank you.